Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about this conference. And indeed, I think I might be coming at things slightly differently than how you've been coming at them so far. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a sec. But I hope that you'll see overlap as well and really some complementarity. You see my title, Sustainable Development in Global Mountain Regions. Given that this is a Sustainable Summits Conference, not terribly informative thus far. But I will focus on what I'm calling the society-centered perspective. And again, I'll get to that in a second. But I think it'll resonate with a lot of you who've been out there traveling already. But it is intended as an overview as well. So I'll make some generalizations. It'll be relatively superficial. I'm happy to get deeper into the weeds afterwards or this evening or what have you. I'm around. So please follow up or follow up with questions thereafter as well. Let's see. So to get started, a couple questions sort of need to be addressed. For you guys in this audience, maybe less so the first one. It's obvious you have an inherent pull towards the mountains for whatever reason, personal reasons. But when I tell my parents that I'm working on an institute dedicated to mountain regions development, they say, why mountains? And indeed, their point is well taken. Of course, there's problems, there are issues, environmental, social, economic, in the plains, in the lowlands, and desert regions, and non-mountain regions. But the mountains are different, and I'll explain exactly how in just a little bit, but they're measurably and observably different. And while in this conference we've talked a lot about how we impact the mountains, rightfully so, indeed this is our concern, the mountains also shape humans in that they pattern behavior. And they constrain choices, and they make certain choices more inevitable than others. And this has resulted in a host of different outcomes. And that is worth considering when we pursue policy, when we talk about sustainability or we talk about development more broadly. And then the other one is, what is development? I think even probably several days here into our conference, we have a notion of what sustainability is, but there's still a bit of wiggle room, is there not? There's a little bit of fuzziness around just what sustainability means exactly. We know on the one hand it evokes an environmental component. We know on the other hand it evokes a sort of temporal component, a timepiece. We're looking for some sort of durability and environmental longevity, but it's not entirely clear. Our institute, which I'll explain a little bit more at the very end if there's an opportunity, takes things from somewhat of a human development perspective, which doesn't explicitly evoke an environmental component, but yet it does. And that's based on the work of Amartya Sen in as early as 1990, actually as early as the 80s. He's an Indian-born economist who has actually since gone on to very much influence the United Nations in their development policy thinking. The emphasis, well, it sort of tips your conventional economic development wisdom on its head, which is that you have a poor country or you have a country where hunger might be high. Well, then we need to inject money into that country. We need to inject food aid into that country, and then they'll have the materials with which to prosper in time, right? Like their Western counterparts or what have you. But it tips it on its head by saying, well, instead of every one of us, for that matter, instead of envisioning a bank account, let's envision the materials, the capital that you have to actually go forth and prosper, the tools that you're equipped with, consisting of something else, mainly your health and your education. So things like your literacy rates, your life expectancy if you look at a population, but maybe more on an individual scale, whether or not you suffer from chronic hunger and malnutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, waterborne illnesses, probably things you've actually encountered in some of your travels in remote mountain regions. If you look at it that way, that's your stock, that's your bank account. Income might be part of that, but it's not the only thing. Your health and your education contribute, and they're the tools. And then you ask, are they adequate enough to make you or allow you to go forth and actually prosper, actually capitalize in the world around you? And as we see, some populations are less well equipped than others. And then that leads to questions of why. So that's sort of the perspective from which we're departing. So circling back to mountains specifically, well, Yeah, we've all heard the stories. We know that mountains in medieval times may have kept encroaching empires from dominating other regions because mountains were in the way. But in 2014, how do mountains still matter necessarily in a grand social sense? Well, unfortunately, there's a lot of negative attributes that are associated with global mountain regions, including poverty, food insecurity, human insecurity, in particular armed conflict, civil conflict, environmental challenges, as you know, environmental change, but also demographic pressures stemming largely from globalization, not necessarily just globalization, like human population increases, state society breakdowns, and these are unfortunately happening at greater and more persistent rates in mountain regions than their lowland counterparts. So if you look at poverty, for example, these figures come from sampling in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. So it's not a global sample. At the same time, as you know, Hindu Kush Himalaya ranging anywhere from Myanmar over to Pakistan, including India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, is a huge area and probably one of the most populated mountain regions of the world. And there consistently, with the exception of India, poverty rates based on consumption in this case are greater in mountain regions than their lowland regions. And India, you can imagine actually why. It's not a stretch to understand why India might be different with such a huge population, much of it falling outside of mountain regions, and the caste system there being so important and a determining factor as well. But otherwise, that has held true over time as well, so it's been persistent. So even as countries have experienced reductions in poverty, mountain regions have experienced reductions in poverty maybe, or at a less steep rate. And so it's not only that there's more, it's different in mountain regions as well. The determinants of poverty are different in mountain regions frequently. And that's that first black box there, the access to basic facilities like health facilities and like education facilities. So again, sort of evoking that human development component, being one large component or driver of poverty in mountain regions. Whereas assets and liabilities, less so, like they might be in an urban or lowland setting where the economic landscape is much different. I'll explain a little bit more of that in just a sec. Hunger, unfortunately, is also very prevalent in global mountain regions. Collectively, between poverty and hunger, if global mountain regions were a country, they would actually rank very low in the world as far as development is concerned, along these lines of metrics that I've been discussing. So in global mountain regions, 90% of the global mountain regions' populations are under what we call developing or lesser developed countries, some pejorative term that we're still struggling with identifying, right? But poor countries, as we know them. Okay? And much of these people are at risk of hunger. World Food Organization study, these figures are somewhat dated, forgive me, 2002, indicate that mountain populations also suffer disproportionately from chronic hunger and micronutrient deficiency. And that matters. Again, from that human development perspective, right? If chronic hunger is persistent, intergenerational, right, and widespread in your population, that bank account that I was just talking about has been shrunk, right, and remains shrunk. And those are your tools, right? So now your hammer to hit that nail has been small, or it's made of tin, right? Besides directly contributing to infant mortality, physical, actually measurable impacts of something like hunger is stunting. So actually chronic hunger versus acute hunger is measured in growth compared to sort of a global mean for your age. So say you're in the far western region of Nepal and you would like to pursue mountain guiding. In fact, your capability set, that bank account with which you have to pursue that, has been shrunk because you might be suffering from stunting. Maybe you want to go to an urban area or go to university. And this, by the way, is, again, I'm making generalizations. This occurs here in population. In fact, there's hunger in Denver. I want to make that not clear. I'm not trying to stigmatize any one country. But yeah, there's cognitive development issues associated with chronic hunger. And chronic hunger is often set in the first 1,000 days of your life, so it's beyond your control, right? But this is setting up populations for greater challenges ahead in life, okay? Again, shrinking that toolbox with which you have to work. Other themes that come up relevant and that we look at in the Institute, relevant to mountain populations more generally and development in these regions, are things like sociocultural identities. Because, as you probably already are well aware, in these regions, frequently we're talking about within that country's ethnic, religious, or cultural minority. Okay? So these are frequently socially, economically, and politically marginalized communities. In other words, their power to then represent themselves, their power to affect change is diminished. Okay? So that's an important contribution. And these tend to overlap. They tend to well reinforce each other. That's important. So while I've kind of siloed these, they blend. They work in harmony or in disharmony, unfortunately. The state and state-society relations in global mountain regions is a real crux. On the one hand, like I just said, poverty, one of the determinants in mountain regions, is access to basic services. And it's those basic services which we think are necessary to help build that toolbox, build that bank account, improve life expectancy, improve access to healthcare, improve education, literacy, and so on and so forth. But you have to remember, in some of these regions, and historically based on historic patterns, these are frequently populations that have distrusted the state, and rightfully so, because the state has been a force for homogenization, a force for ordering, a force of counting in order to tax and extract and to commodify resources, natural resources, which are frequently found in mountain regions, whether that's gold or water to dam, and so on and so forth. Combine that with the fact that these populations are socially, politically, economically marginalized, and you have the recipe for conflict as well. Just grievances frequently, combined with rough terrain, has statistically been proven to exacerbate, draw out, or lengthen civil and armed conflict in these places. So mountains don't cause conflict, of course, but they do contribute to the length. And again, you can see how these things can overlap. And that's not just a historical figment. When you think of even today's news cycle, the M23 rebels in the Congo, where did they organize? Where did they collect? The Nuba Mountains of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't know if anyone's climbed in the Nuba Mountains, probably not, but there they were. So minor ranges can nevertheless have a big influence on grand social outcomes. Others, I'll go through these a little more quickly, constraints on economic development. In other words, the pathways to prosperity that we take advantage of or take for granted here in, say, the Front Range don't necessarily exist in mountain regions per se. The infrastructure, the human capital, access to basic services, access to things like banking services, financial services, again, elements of racism or social exclusion mixed into that, and you have limited choices with which to pursue economic growth. And frequently those boil down to only a couple things. Maybe tourism or resort-based tourism, which has its own environmental implications as you guys have been noting. But more likely, again, under the auspices of sort of weak regulation, a state that's looking for sources of funding, is resource-based extraction. Again, gold, cobalt, tin, so on and so forth. As you know, that could be oil and gas. That can be a lot of money. So maybe that's actually very valuable. But another thing we see is that frequently these areas are providing primary resources. In other words, the raw resources. The cobalt that gets extracted but goes somewhere else to get smelted and turned into aluminum sold for high prices. So frequently these same communities, if they aren't wholly dependent on a single resources, they're also subject to vagaries in global prices beyond their control. And they're left, of course, with the negative consequences of natural resource extraction, right? The mine tailings, cyanide, so on and so forth from gold mining. So the negative externalities always remain local. That's something that's peculiar to natural resource management. Whereas the profits, they can float elsewhere, right? So you can extract for oil and gas in Alaska, and the profits might flow to Houston, Texas. But the impacts stay local, and that's really important to remember. So there are constraints. Securitization of borders. This is more of an international relations component, but we know these same regions, and particularly mountainous border regions, the political boundaries, if not already arbitrary, are porous, right? And there's real reason to be concerned about drug, arm, and human trafficking in these regions. But the militarization and the securitization of these borders also has side effects. And finally, climate change. There's a great pamphlet. I didn't bring it up here. It's actually in Spanish. It's in the back, about observable trends. And there's references in there, English language references, so I do encourage you to pick it up. But very real-time observable links between glacier recession, lack of water, and then social conflict that has arisen from that. Let's see. Oops, yeah, this way. Well, I've talked about a lot of negative things, so forgive me. Are there positive mountain attributes, or are there things that we can capitalize? Well, it takes sort of a reframing of the question, or expectations, again, of what development might necessarily mean. But yeah, indeed, there's ways to kind of move beyond the conventional wisdom of development that, frankly, we still very much pursue, even though we know better. Governmental agencies and countries and their aid agencies are particularly guilty of this. But there's those of us, and it's certainly not just me, there's plenty of us who are working to rethink how development takes place in some of these communities we partner with. And one is what, as a political scientist, we call the governance approach. But shelve the jargon for a second. It's just a realization that the mayor, right, who's ordained by a constitution in a capital city which has no relevance to local populations, may not, in fact, have the power of the purse, or may not, in fact, be the best person to partner with in a local community, but that they're informal actors, okay? Whether they're religious leaders or traditional leaders, who have a ton of legitimacy with their local communities. And in fact, those would be the people to partner with most when trying to actually collectively organize. Having said that, this state isn't necessarily going away, right? This is 2014. States are really here to stay, and they're durable, and their weight can be felt even in places where their presence isn't necessarily brick and mortar. So how can we marry what I just said, some of these local leaders with a ton of local legitimacy and authority, with state actors and state resources? And there's a trickle of feedback that this is happening in small places. And so there can be some positive results from an organization like that. And then, as you guys priori know, identify nodes of local resilience and local capacity. So that's not romanticizing the local. Indeed, the local can have things that are difficult for us to understand. For instance, if gender empowerment is a non-issue in some of these communities, things of that nature, right, that really clash with some of our Western notions of justice. They may not, in fact, be placed. So I don't want to over-romanticize the local. At the same time, there's strengths and weaknesses, organizational strengths and weaknesses, clan ties, family ties, religious ties, local knowledge about environmental change that we can utilize. Okay. And then finally, as I've mentioned, I think measuring things from an input side of things, so new schools built, new hospitals built, do not necessarily translate or reflect really development in a holistic sense that I think we collectively, including our local partners, are seeking. So let's move beyond a strictly technical fix to some of the things we're talking about and recognize that we're actually talking about deep social and economic interactions. So some positive examples of that taking place actually in real time. One that stands out is the case of maternal health in the far western region in particular of Nepal, where as a country, as of 2008, I believe, the nationwide average of an expecting mother was 72% visiting or getting any sort of prenatal care, so visiting with a health professional. Whereas in the far western region, that was 25%. Intrapartum care, or the delivery itself, basically, urban clinics experience, well, urban mothers visited clinics 3.5 times more likely than their rural counterparts. Eclampsia, which is a postpartum side effect which can be very painful, that was getting treated regularly and routinely without any sort of social stigma in urban areas, whereas in the far western region, many women suffered from eclampsia and silence because of, again, a social stigma. So what to do? You have a Minister of Health, which is cash-strapped, as you might imagine. Nevertheless, something like UN partners and the Millennium Development Goals are requiring and asking for better data and better outcomes in rural regions. So you have a government under pressure to do something. And one of the things they've done is create these female community health volunteers. So these aren't ER docs, okay, and you don't have a state-of-the-art emergency rooms or delivery service, but nevertheless, you have a woman from your community who speaks your dialect, okay, working with you and providing, trained by the government, but now in your rural community where the government otherwise can't reach, working with on prenatal care and actually through the whole process, prenatal, intrapartum, and post-delivery care. And early results seem to be very positive as far as, well, not just eclampsia, but infant mortality rates in some of these rural communities. In the interest of time, I'll skip the Guatemala case study, other than it's an example of that state-local complementarity, and otherwise a marriage of state resources sort of deferring some power, which is very rare for a state to do. And by the way, I'm not celebrating the Guatemalan state. It does a lot of bad. But in this one community, it has sensibly sort of backed off and deferred the delivery and the equitable delivery of some basic but important social services where chronic hunger is extremely high rates to local authorities who have no formal authority, but are simply actually informal religious leaders. So in an international context, unfortunately, mountain regions, and I don't know if us as climbers necessarily are aware of this, are laden with many vulnerable populations. Human development in mountain communities requires we rethink success, and then again, these technical fixes which still sort of dominate development thinking globally, not just in development regions. Mountains can empower, yes, but they can also constrain. They can also constrain choices. They can constrain access. And this is one of the cruxes that we encounter. And under this intense pressure, globalization and climate change, and then some of these social and economic pressures I've already talked about, mountain communities need our support in a way that I don't think necessarily climbers have realized yet. So with that, yeah, this is a burgeoning institute that I'm working on. We're obviously looking for financial support, but we're also looking for human support in terms of board of directors, in terms of contributions scientifically or otherwise. It's an interdisciplinary nonprofit institute that is, as we speak, getting off the ground just barely. So I'll leave you with that, but you have a sense of our mission and our work. And thank you guys very much for yours and for organizing this conference. Really appreciate it. All right, thank you.
We've got time for a couple of questions.
Yes, sir.
Have you noticed what other things give people in the mountains resilience? Because obviously it's a tough place to live. You mentioned a few, but if you could kind of rephrase that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. They tend to be subtle. So like I said, with respect to, say, environmental change, local knowledge. So in that pamphlet, for example, physical scientists were cooperating with moms of 5